Okay, today I have with me Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky to go over some of the biggest news stories that you guys are concerned about. Senator Paul, thank you so much for joining me.
Glad to be with you. Thanks for having me.
So right now, other than Hunter Biden, Bidenomics, the southern border, the big topic in the news is TikTok and Congress wanting to force the sale of the Chinese portion of this company to an American company or some entity other than China. What are your thoughts on this bill? I know that you are one of the few standing against it, or at least wanting to better understand what it is before shutting it down.
There's a couple of problems, and they're in the Bill of Rights. The First Amendment says that people are allowed to express themselves and the government shall make no law abridging that freedom. So 170 million Americans log on to TikTok. I don't know what they do. They dance, tell stories, whatever they do on TikTok, they do it, but they express themselves. And so they would have a course of action if you tell them they're not allowed to express themselves on this venue. The bill essentially says that the app can't be sold by in the Apple Store. When you go to buy apps, that you're not allowed to buy it. So it's actually directed not just at TikTok; it's at others who sell things, and these are things that are sold where people express themselves through an app. So there's a big First Amendment problem. The federal court system has already declared it unconstitutional 3 times. When Trump tried to do it through executive order, the court struck it down twice. And then Montana recently tried to ban it, and it was struck down there for constitutional reasons. Above and beyond the First Amendment arguments, there are Fifth Amendment arguments. You really can't just take someone's property without due process. There are a lot of accusations that are hurled at TikTok, many of which are based on untruths or lies. For example, on Fox News, one of the broadcasters said, "Oh, well, they're owned by the Chinese Communist government," which is frankly and provably untrue. They're owned 60% by international investors, including Americans. They're owned 20% by the Chinese software engineers that developed the app, and they're owned 20% by their employees, which includes 7,000 Americans. So if an American's property is going to be taken, you're saying, oh, they have to sell? You're essentially taking their property, because what if there's no buyer during that period of time? Their company, which is said to be worth billions, could be worth zero. So then you've stolen billions of dollars of value by forcing a sale. Also, if I tell you you have to sell your car in 6 months and you're not getting the price you want, and everybody knows you have to sell tomorrow, what happens to the price? The price is going to go down. So the Fifth Amendment says that you have to convict somebody. So most of the time, if you listen to all the complaints about TikTok, they're like, well, the communist government could demand their data at any point because of this national security law. Well, maybe. Prove that the American data is going that way. TikTok's actually bent over backwards to try to protect the data. They heard all of these complaints. They make a lot of money. They're worth a lot of money. So they spent over $1 billion housing the data in Texas with Oracle. The data is reviewed by Oracle. The TikTok board is 3 out of 5 Americans on the board. They've done all of the things that we typically ask for foreign-owned companies. And so almost everything they say about TikTok is untrue. There is a censored version of TikTok called Douyin that is in China, and the Chinese Communist government does have a seat on that. That's the way it works in China. Everybody operates that way. In fact, Apple does the same, and we can complain about it. But if you use an iPhone in China, your data goes to a government server owned by the government. Apple just complied with that. Now, a lot of people complain about that. I'm not particularly, wouldn't be happy about it if I was in China using an iPhone, knowing that the government can suck up all my data. But that is a complaint that if we're going to ban TikTok, are we going to ban Apple? Because Apple's doing some of the same things. And they haven't yet proposed that. But should we be worried about giving a president enough power to ban a company like Apple, like TikTok, billion-dollar companies? And what if they decide the next thing is we're going to ban people for disinformation, election misinformation? That could well be me or you. So, I mean, the thing is, we have to be a little worried about giving the power to ban speech to the president. So I'm absolutely opposed to this.
Yeah. Well, we know from the Twitter files that the Biden administration likes to interfere in the public. They like to dictate to these social media companies who can be on there, who's allowed to be popular, who's allowed to have a post surge. If it doesn't follow the narrative, then they want to shut that down. One of the narratives that they tried to shut down the hardest, that I have appreciated you continuing to look into this topic, is COVID, and all of the control mechanisms that they were pulling to try to force vaccines, to control us talking to each other about big pharma, things like that. Is it true? I want to talk about your new book, but is it true that some of these scientists, especially through the NIH, can collectively receive hundreds of millions of dollars from big pharma in royalties? Is that true?
Yeah, I have a new book called Deception, the Great COVID Cover-Up. And in the book, we do detail this. What has been determined, I think it's by Open Secrets, openthebooks.com, Open Secrets, I get confused on the nonprofit, but they have discovered that over 300 NIH scientists have received over $200 million. So it's not chump change. This is quite a bit of money, over $200 million. It's over a 10-year period, but they won't tell us which scientists and which companies. So you can't match them up and say, oh, 3 people on the vaccine got over $100,000 last year from Pfizer. Why are they voting on making the Pfizer vaccine mandatory for us? Why are they pushing this vaccine without declaring their conflict of interest? So we recently passed a bill on this. This was a big success, really. We convinced the Democrat chairman of our committee to sign on. He's co-sponsored. And once that happens, it sort of greases the wheels, and it went out unanimously out of committee. So in a few weeks, we're going to try putting this to the floor and see if we can unanimously pass it in the Senate. And this will be a direct rebuke to Anthony Fauci, because when he came before my committee, I asked him, does anybody on the vaccine committees receive royalties? And his answer was basically to thumb his nose and say, we don't have to tell you, the law protects us. Now, we disagree with his interpretation of the law, but we're going to add to the law to make it explicit. This will be a public filing. You'll be able to look it up. Anybody will be able to look it up. And if someone on the committee is receiving royalties or has received royalties within the past 2 years, we're going to know about it. And we shouldn't have policy dictated by people who are somehow becoming enriched by the same policy.
Yeah. My biggest worry is, like, especially for people like Anthony Fauci, it seems like many members of Congress run interference on his behalf. They're willing to look the other way. They don't ask the hard questions. It's almost like they don't want to know. I don't know if that's because many of them receive corporate donor money from Pfizer and others. But do you think that this bill will actually pass, and that we'll be able to get to the bottom of where the origins of COVID actually come from?
I think the bill has a very good chance of passing because it's a transparency bill. It's just a filing kind of requirement for the scientists. You know, your members of Congress already have similar filing requirements, and ours are publicly online. I think making these easy to find and easy to see will chasten some of these people. Now, does this, get to the heart of origins? Not necessarily. I think this gets us moving forward to try to restrain their behavior on, their conflicts of interest. On the origins, I think we've largely won the argument. I think the scientific community has come to our side now. There still are stalwart defenders who will not listen. And I think the reason they defend Anthony Fauci is because it's the core of their philosophy. The core of their philosophy is that central big government is good, whether it be for the economy, for poverty, for anything, but including public health. And so the minute they begin to doubt that someone could make a mistake up here, then the cracks will appear, and people will say, well, gosh, why do we have to submit to a central edict? Why can't we make our own decision on whether we want to be vaccinated? They don't really want that kind of thinking to occur. That's wrong think, and they want submission. And really, this has been always more about submission than it has been about the science. Because as you go through the science, there are two sides to a lot of this, and really some nuance, to tell you the truth. I actually have never told people not to be vaccinated if they're over 65. I think it's a decision everybody should make, but I actually think that the risks of the disease, particularly in 2020, were greater than the risks of the vaccine in 2020 for certain age groups. Now, under 25, I would say there never was a time that the risks of the vaccine were less than the risk of the disease, because the risk of a disease for under 25, if you're healthy, were virtually zero. So in 2020, if you would have asked me, does my 16-year-old or 20-year-old need to be vaccinated? I would say absolutely not. And particularly if you were worried about it, I'd say get them tested to see if they've had COVID. If they've had COVID, 100% they don't need a vaccine. And we could have made nuanced decisions there. But my advice for my 92-year-old father-in-law is different than my advice for a 15-year-old. But this goes against sort of centralization of healthcare. They just, they don't want anybody to think. It's why they try to vaccinate your kids for hepatitis B before they leave the hospital, because they've got a hold of them and they just want to get it done. It's not that your kid really needs a hepatitis B vaccine if the mom doesn't have hepatitis B, but they're trying to get to your kid before your kid gets away from the state. The state is encroached into the hospitals and tries to get a hold of our kids, get them their Social Security number, get them their vaccine, et cetera. But I think that one of the things that's come out of this debate is there's stronger and stronger voices for medical freedom. The people who were concerned about vaccines was a really tiny group of people for a long time. And now it's grown such that we actually passed a law for the first time getting rid of the vaccine mandate for COVID in the military. That's a huge step forward for medical freedom.
Yeah, that's great. I appreciate you continuing to fight for that. If it's okay, I'm gonna put a link to your book down below so that people can go check that out. And I hope that bill will pass and we get that transparency. Just in our last few minutes together, I know that you and your father have really pushed for fiscal responsibility within the government spending. I consider myself to be a libertarian. We're $34 trillion in debt. Is this a number that's now insurmountable? And so many members of Congress are saying, forget it. Until I'm out of office, I'll just let the future generation pay that off. Or could we actually start making progress on paying that down and becoming a nation that isn't so crippled by this massive amount of debt?
The first thing you have to do is quit adding to it. If we could slow down the addition to it, that would be a huge benefit. Even the budgets that I've proposed, which most people in Washington are, consider to be too draconian to actually put in place, are balancing over 5 years. And these are the most dramatic budgets ever presented in Washington in modern history. And mine will balance over 5 years, which means still even some debt is added over 5 years. But you have to get to balance your annual budget. And we're so far out of whack, considering what to do with the 34 trillion, they have no clue and nobody has a plan for that. But what they're doing is adding 1.5 trillion. And my biggest complaint right now, and this is going on as we speak here in Washington, there's another spending bill that will be on the floor. They just released it this morning. It'll have thousands of earmarks. It'll add $1.5 trillion to the debt. But where is the Republican majority? We have a Republican majority. It's very small, but where's the leverage of the majority in the House doing something to restrain spending? Speaker Johnson, I want to like him, and I thought at the beginning he might be a breath of fresh air, and he's turned out to be no different than all the others. They just, it's sort of the Mussolini maxim, the trains must run on time. We got to get the trains out the door, which means we got to shovel the money out the door. But we have a majority in the House. We also have 49 in the Senate. And what does that mean? In the Senate, nothing passes without 60 votes. So if the 49 of us would stick together and work with the majority, together, our leadership plus the Republican leadership in the House could set a meeting with Schumer and say, you don't get all this spending, you get half of it. We split the difference. We want a balanced budget this year. You want a 1.5 trillion. We're going to split the difference. And it's going to be $750 billion instead of 1.5 trillion. That would be a compromise. It still wouldn't be great. It would still be this enormous government with an enormous debt, but we're not doing any of that. 2/3 of the spending is entitlements, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, and Social Security. Nobody's touching that. Even many so-called conservatives say, oh, we're not looking at entitlements. And Donald Trump said, we're not going to touch entitlements. And he criticized DeSantis for wanting to reform these programs. You're not a serious person if you are unwilling to look at the entitlements. That's 2/3 of the spending. There's not enough in the budget that we vote for to do anything unless we look at entitlements. In the budget that we actually vote on, it's about 1.5 trillion, equal to the debt, essentially. The entire budget I vote on equals the debt. That spending is half military and half non-military. Well, the military is going up at 3%. So entitlements is 2/3 of spending going up at 5 or 6%. Military is going up at 3%. So what does that leave? 16% of the budget, non-military discretionary spending. That's what we're looking at. You could eliminate that and you'd still have a $750 billion deficit. So we really have to look at all spending. And that's why for years I proposed a penny plan, which is you knock 1% of everything or you knock 5% of everything, whatever it takes to balance the budget in 5 years, because I think that's a reasonable time to get it done. And it takes that, but you can't do it by looking at one segment. And this sort of separates conservatives from libertarians. The conservatives, or the hawkish conservatives up here, will not touch a dime of military spending. In fact, they complain and moan that it's only going up 3%, inflation 6%. We need a 6 or 7% increase in the military. And, they would wipe out some of the welfare programs, and the liberals would be less spendthrift on the military, but the compromises both go up. Military goes up and the well. So warfare and welfare both go up. And we need the opposite compromise where both are brought into control.
Yeah, we need those control mechanisms, because on the one hand, everybody admits Social Security is going to run out of money. On the other hand, it's like they're trying to speed it up in order to get votes, and it does get confusing for the American people. Final question. I appreciate you coming on, Senator. What are your thoughts on the southern border situation? A couple days ago, people in my community, we were cheering. Okay, the Supreme Court said Texas can arrest, detain, and deport people. Then the Fifth Circuit Court comes out and says, actually, no, you need to stick with the federal rules. I think a lot of people are feeling like Biden and this administration, they're just purposely allowing the country to be flooded with illegal immigrants. What are your thoughts on that?
I think the court's not fully decided yet. I don't think we have the final answer from the court on what will happen. I hope the court decides in favor of the states having ability to protect themselves. It's essentially self-defense. People are coming in, marauding, ruining property, killing people. We got to do something about it. The first thing we need to acknowledge is that our border is more important than the border between Ukraine and Russia, and that we need to fix our border before we think about going abroad to fix other people's border. And this has been true for a long time, not just Ukraine, Russia. There's a lot of borders around the world we think we're responsible for putting in order, and we ignore our own border. So I think the powers that exist in the executive branch are adequate. When Trump was president, he sort of browbeat the president of Mexico to keep him down there, and they had a remain in Mexico policy. That was the strength of character of Trump that did that. Now, there are complaints that Trump is sometimes a bull in a china shop. That's true. But then again, that bull in the china shop stared down the Mexican president and said they're staying down there. And the numbers dwindled as they decided that camping out in northern Mexico wasn't as exciting as coming in and enjoying the welfare system in the United States. They quit coming, and then the numbers dwindled under Trump. You need that again. This president won't do it. And so he complains and says, oh, if the Republicans would have passed that border money, I would be able to do it. Well, the same week he was complaining about wanting more money, he was in the Supreme Court suing Texas over putting up barriers. So it's rank hypocrisy. He doesn't care about the border. Most of the Democrats up here want a flood of immigrants. They look at it as a long-range vote plan. The majority of the immigrants that are coming illegally, the vast majority, their children will vote Democrat. So they've been doing this for 20 years. Now the kids are voting, and they're voting Democrat. They've taken over California, and California is 75% Democrat now and never coming back. Texas is 50-50. But if you let the million or two that are in there illegally vote in Texas, Texas would be Democrat now. But it becomes more and more Democrat every year, the more and more you let the new people come in as their kids are born here and then reach maturity. Whether we have a change in citizenship or voting, they are voting. And so we have to go after their votes. But I think we also have to, we have to control the border. Many of my friends, I grew up in Texas, were Hispanic, and not many of them wanted open borders either. So it's not like the Hispanic community is completely and solidly sort of for open borders. But we do have to acknowledge, I think, as representatives of the people, that there are many good people who just got here. I often say some of the best Americans just got here. And I have many good friends in my town who are Indian American doctors, Pakistani American doctors. We have people from Bosnia in my community. So there's a lot of good people that have come here. These people have all come legally, and they become part of the community and are successful in our community. But I think it's important as a Republican not to be, oh, the border's bad, which it is, and we should control it. But we shouldn't at the same time send out or emit this message that we aren't friendly towards people who have come to this country legally.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Thank you very much. I know we're pressed for time. I appreciate you coming on. Keep up the good work. Keep fighting for we the people. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you. Thank